I'm creating this video to help you out with the heart anatomy portion of your 122 SPOs. There'll be another video corresponding with a handout regarding blood flow through the heart and the body, and so you want to attempt that handout first that you'll find in the folder where you found this video, and then watch that video that helps to go over the handout and see if you got everything correct. So make sure to do that as well. So let's get going here. So you can see the heart inside of the pericardial cavity. And you might have learned about the mediastinum and how the pericardial cavity is on the inferior portion of it. But anyway, you can see the sternum here, and where the heart kind of sits. About 2/3 of it sits to the left of the body. The apex is kind of this inferior pointy portion. It kind of points down to the lower left side of the body here. But that's the apex of the heart. You'll see that in your SPOs. This next image is showing you the heart obviously cut coronally or frontally. And then what they're doing is, let me grab my laser pointer here. They're taking this box and they're blowing that portion up to see it in more detail here in the kind of the upper portion of your screen. So there are a couple terms in your SPOs dealing with this portion. So around the heart you have what's called the pericardial sac. And the pericardial sac is made up of kind of two main structures here. There's a thick outer connective tissue called the fibrous pericardium. So that's kind of the most superficial portion of the sac that the heart kind of sits in. And then the inner lining of that pericardial sac is called the parietal pericardium. It's a serous membrane, and it's often known as the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. But in your SPOs, they call it the parietal pericardium. So that's the parietal pericardium, and then the thicker fibrous pericardium. Those two make up what we call the pericardial sac. And then that parietal pericardium actually kind of circles back around, and it lines the outside of the actual heart. And so that lining on the outside of the heart is a slippery serous membrane called the visceral pericardium. And so we have the visceral pericardium, and that has another name. It's called the epicardium, epi meaning above. So kind of the outer part of the actual heart is called the epicardium or visceral pericardium. Again, another name for it. So again, we have the visceral pericardium, epicardium, and then we have the parietal pericardium, and then the fibrous pericardium. And you can see a space between the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. And so just like every cavity in our body, there's a visceral serous membrane and a parietal, and between the two is the cavity with serous fluid, called the pericardial cavity in this case. You don't see that in your SPOs, the pericardial cavity, but you do see again, the epicardium, visceral pericardium, another name for it, parietal pericardium, and the fibrous pericardium. So those are the three that you see in your SPOs there. So this is a cadaver image, obviously. We have the lungs here, and then we have this, basically the pericardial sac, and the outer layer of that, remember, is the fibrous pericardium. And so remember, that covers the heart, right? That fibrous pericardium and the pericardial sac that the fibrous pericardium is a part of. So you can't really see the heart, but it's in there. It's inside of that sac, that connective tissue. Okay, so this image is doing something similar. Again, we have a coronal section of the heart. There's a box here, and the illustrator is blowing up that box to see some of the heart wall in more detail. And so we just talked about this outer layer of the actual heart tissue here, not the pericardial sac, but the outer layer of the heart, called the epicardium, aka also known as visceral pericardium. And then we get to the thick layer of the heart wall called the myocardium. And this is actual cardiac muscle tissue that depolarizes and contracts. So that's called myocardium. Myo meaning muscle. So that's a cardiac muscle tissue layer. That's the thickest layer of the heart wall. And then lining these chambers, inside of the heart, you have these chambers, and lining them, there's another slippery membrane. It's called the endocardium. Endo meaning within. So deep within the heart, the deepest layer of the heart wall is the endocardium. So you'll see those in your SPOs. Okay, so this is showing you a picture of a cadaver heart, and you can see how shiny it looks when you're looking at the outside of it. And that shiny, slippery layer is the epicardium, also known as the visceral pericardium. So just showing you another image. And so obviously the pericardial sac is removed. You can't see the fibrous pericardium or parietal pericardium. And so you're actually looking at the outside of the heart wall here in the epicardium. Okay, so I like to start off talking in more detail about heart anatomy by first talking about the heart using a model. And later on in your SPOs, and a portion of it talks about knowing the basically tracing the path blood takes through the heart and the body. And again, there's a handout that I'm posting, and also a video to help with that handout. But this model that we'll talk about kind of helps with that idea too, but also helps orient us to just the heart in general. So think of this whole box as being the heart. Okay, I'm going to grab a pen here. Make it black, I think is what color I want to make it. All right, there we go. So think of this whole box as being the heart, and there's 4 major chambers inside of the heart. And so remember, it's the patient's left and right. And so on this side, we have the right atrium, it's called. So you can have a little key if you want to help label this stuff. So right atrium is the name of that chamber. Oops. Sorry about that. It's kind of hard to write on this. There we go. Right atrium. And you'll see that in your SPOs. And then below that is also the right side, but this is the right... excuse me. What am I doing? I was writing right left, but that is not right. Let me erase that real quick. That is the right ventricle. So RV equals right. I'm not doing too good with this screen pen I have here, but let me try again. R for right. This is just not working out for me, is it? Try my best here. Right ventricle. There we go. That's an E, by the way, right here. Right ventricle. All right, so we have the right atrium, right ventricle. All right, so now on the left side, we have the same chambers, the atrium ventricle, but obviously left. So we have left atrium up top and the left ventricle down below. Okay, so now I'm going to use basically red for oxygenated blood and blue for deoxygenated blood. And so what's going to happen, we're going to learn, is the right atrium is going to have deoxygenated blood come into it. And we're going to learn that the vena cava, superior and inferior vena cava, carries that deoxygenated blood into that right atrium. So I'm going to label this arrow here, and I'm just going to kind of draw it halfway for now as DO2. So that's deoxygenated blood. So that flows into the right atrium. From the right atrium, that deoxygenated blood flows down through, through a valve we'll talk about. That's what this dotted line represents between the right atrium and right ventricle. So it flows through that valve into the right ventricle, and then that deoxygenated blood gets pumped out of that right ventricle, and it goes to the lungs. And why does it go to the lungs? Well, it goes to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So now we have red for oxygenated blood. And the oxygenated blood gets pumped from the lungs into the left side of the heart, into the left atrium. And so now we have oxygenated blood, O2. I'm going to go back to my blue because I didn't label this other line as also, whoops, hold on here. Go back. So this is also deoxygenated blood. Whoops, I guess, hold on a second, sorry about that. Gotta grab my pen again. Alright, so this is DO2. So again, deoxygenated blood comes into the right atrium, goes through a valve, it's called the tricuspid, one name of it, into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, deoxygenated blood gets pumped to the lungs, picks up oxygen. Now the oxygenated blood gets pumped into the left side of the heart, the left atrium. So the atria are the upper receiving chambers of the heart. They receive blood. The ventricles are the discharging chambers. They discharge that blood to different parts of the body. Okay, so we are now in the left atrium with that oxygenated blood. Whoops, let me go back to red here because we have oxygenated blood. That oxygenated blood goes through another valve. It's called the bicuspid, just one name of it. It has three names actually. Into the left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, that oxygenated blood gets pumped out and it goes to, let me grab a different color, all body tissues. So all body tissues of our body need oxygenated blood. And the oxygen is dropped off at those body tissues. And now we're going to go back to blue because we have deoxygenated blood, because that oxygenated blood was dropped off, the oxygen was. So actually I'm going to label, first of all, this arrow as oxygenated, O2. And now go back to blue, because now we have deoxygenated blood. And that deoxygenated blood picks up with this arrow we drew at the beginning. And it's already labeled as deoxygenated. And so that deoxygenated blood gets dumped into the right side of the heart, the right atrium. And so this is a good figure to kind of look at and study a little bit. Obviously, there's quite a few more details, more structures that we aren't talking about right now, but it helps to just to understand this overall basic idea here, that deoxygenated blood enters into the right atrium, which flows down into the right ventricle. Out of the right ventricle, it gets pumped to the lungs. Now it's oxygenated. That oxygenated blood gets pumped into the left atrium, or it gets dumped, I should say. The left atrium, the blood flows down into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle contracts, and the oxygenated blood gets pumped to all body tissues where oxygen is dropped off, carbon dioxide is picked up, and now that low oxygenated blood, deoxygenated blood, gets pumped into the right atrium, and we start all over again. So really the heart is kind of two pumps in one. It's got the right side that pumps to the lungs and back from the lungs, and the left side that pumps to all body tissues and back to the heart from all body tissues. In your SPOs, you'll look at what's called there's two circuits, the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. So the pulmonary circuit deals with the lungs. And so the right ventricle pumps into the pulmonary circuit. And so the deoxygenated blood leaving the right ventricle, those vessels carrying it to the lungs from the right ventricle is part of the pulmonary circuit. Also, Once it's oxygenated, that blood coming back from the lungs is part of the pulmonary circuit and pumped into the left atrium. So that's also pulmonary. So we have, I'm going to grab another color here. I'm just going to put Peasbine. This is part of the pulmonary circuit, and this is part of the pulmonary circuit. And then the systemic circuit is the other one. The left ventricle pumps into the systemic circuit to all body tissues, and then that oxygenated blood drops off oxygen, and then the systemic circuit also carries that deoxygenated blood back to the right side of the heart. So again, we have the pulmonary circuit dealing with pumping to the lungs and back to the heart from the lungs, and the systemic circuit pumping to all body tissues and then back to the heart from all body tissues. So that's basically the idea between the pulmonary circuits and the systemic circuits. So one other quick thing here before we get going again. I already mentioned a couple of valves involved. So between the right atrium and right ventricle, and this arrow kind of represents it, there's a valve, and it has two names. It has the name of a tricuspid valve or a right atrioventricular valve. And then there's another valve between the left atrium and left ventricle. And that has a name, actually three different names. The left atrioventricular valve, the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve. So definitely know all three because you could see any one of the three on your exam. Same thing with the right atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve. So anyway, I'm just pointing out there are other structures involved here, and we'll talk more about them as we go along. There are actually two more valves that we didn't discuss at all that we'll discuss as we go along here, okay? But I think this does a good job of helping us orient to the heart and getting us thinking about it. Okay, so let's take a look at some images here. So again, the heart is made up of basically 4 chambers, and I'm going to use red here and kind of show you. So this is a portion of the, I'm writing L here, I meant to write R, the right atrium. This is a portion of the right ventricle. This is a portion of the left ventricle. And up here, a little portion of the left, atrium. There we go. Over here, you can see them a little bit better. So really what's going on here, you have 2 images of the same heart, but the image on the right side of the screen, it's cut coronally, just like the image on the right side, but the image on the left is not cut as deep as the image on the right. So in APR, when you're using Anatomy and Physiology Revealed, you'll see different images like this, and it depends on how deep the anatomist cut. And by cutting more superficially or deeper, you're going to see different structures as a result of that. So again, the one on the left is cut not as deep as the one on the right. And so let me label the one on the right real quick. We have the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle down below. So again, we have the 4 different chambers that we can see here. We can also see the myocardium in pretty good detail. So all this that I'm kind of squiggling with my pen here, this is the myocardium, with the bulk of the heart wall between the left ventricle and the right ventricle. And that's called the interventricular septum. You'll see that term in your SPOs. And up here, up top, on the right, I'm going to use my pen. This is it's not as thick, but it's a layer of tissue between the right atrium and, what did I put here? Yeah, excuse me. It's a layer between the right atrium and the left atrium, and that's called the interatrial septum. So you'll see that in your SPOs as well. One thing that is in your SPOs too later on is a structure called the fossa ovalis. And it's a little indentation in the interatrial septum. And that little indentation is in a newborn's heart, and in basically after we're born, we have that little indentation called the fossa ovalis in our hearts. When we're a fetus inside the womb, there's actually a hole connecting the right atrium to the left atrium, and blood can flow through that hole, and that's called the foramen ovale. And the foramen ovale is in, like I mentioned, the fetal heart. And it's one way for the fetus to bypass the non-functional lungs. And so, obviously when you're in the womb, you're surrounded by amniotic fluid, and the lungs are not functioning to breathe. The placenta helps to bring oxygenated blood to that fetus. So anyway, like we mentioned, the hole in that interatrial septum in a fetus is called the foramen ovale. And when you take your first breath when you're born, that usually closes and it becomes just a little indentation called the fossa ovalis. So I thought I'd mention that now since we're talking about the interatrial septum here. Okay, so let's see, what else can we see? Superior vena cava, we can see up here. And the vena cava, superior, and then inferior is down below, and you can see the opening of it. I'm circling it here on the left side of your screen. The opening of the inferior vena cava, but both of those dump into the right atrium. They bring the deoxygenated blood from the systemic circuit into the right atrium. Let's see, what else can we see here? Just looking at my SPOs before I move on. Trying to stay sort of in order of what's listed in your SPOs. Okay, so another thing we can see here is what we call pulmonary veins. And so veins bring blood towards the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. That's basically how you define arteries and veins. Again, veins bring blood towards the heart. And so these veins bring blood towards the left atrium. And you can see an opening to another vein here, and here, and here. So basically, all those dump into the left atrium. Remember, the atria are receiving chambers. They receive blood from veins. The vena cava, that's the largest vein in the body. Again, it brings blood to the right atrium. The ones that I outlined on the right side here are called the pulmonary veins. So pulmonary veins, again, they dump blood into the left atrium. And remember, it's oxygenated blood coming from the lungs. So we can see some pulmonary veins there. Okay, so I think that's good for now for this image. So now what we're doing is we have a illustration on the left, obviously, and a cadaver heart on the right. And they're basically showing you the same view of the heart. It's an anterior view, and we can see some structures and kind of compare them to one another. So one thing I want to point out here real quick is when you're looking at the heart, and you're looking at it kind of superficial like we are here at the anterior side, this vessel right here, and I'm going to kind of color it here, show it, you kind of see where I'm pointing. I'm going to go back to my laser pointer. But right here, this vessel is more anterior to this red vessel. The one that's more anterior is called the pulmonary trunk. And that pulmonary trunk is more anterior compared to this other vessel, which is called the aorta, or ascending aorta here. You can see that in the cadaver heart. Pulmonary trunk here is more anterior compared to the little bit more posterior aorta. Both of these are arteries. They both take blood away from the heart. The pulmonary trunk takes blood away from the heart from the right ventricle, and the aorta takes blood away from the heart from the left ventricle. But again, I just wanted to point that out, that when you're looking at them, the pulmonary trunk is more anterior from the aorta. I want to show you another image here. You can see this same thing here in this illustration. Again, we cut the heart coronally. We have the pulmonary trunk here, more anterior, and then the aorta. You can't even see a lot of the aorta because it's behind this pulmonary trunk when you're looking at the anterior view of the heart. Okay, so let's go back here. The pulmonary trunk branches, and so remember from our model, the right ventricle pumps to the lungs deoxygenated blood, and the right ventricle pumps into this pulmonary trunk, and then it branches the pulmonary trunk into what we call pulmonary arteries. And so the pulmonary arteries are where the trunk branches, pulmonary trunk. So the pulmonary arteries carry blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So we already mentioned the aorta. There's kind of this ascending portion of the aorta here. And then we have what's called the aortic arch that kind of arches around. You can see that on the illustration, the aorta, ascending aorta, and then the aortic arch, it's called. And coming off of the aortic arch here, there's three major vessels that branch off of it. And the first vessel here that branches off of the aortic arch is called the brachiocephalic trunk. The next vessel that branches off of the aortic arch is called the left common carotid artery. And then the third vessel is called the left subclavian artery. So those are the three major branches off of the aortic arch: brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid, left subclavian. You may be asking, where is the right common carotid and the right subclavian? Well, when we get to vascular anatomy, which is the next portion of our SPOs, we're going to find out where those are. And actually, they branch off of the brachiocephalic trunk. The right common carotid and the right subclavian branch off of the brachiocephalic trunk. But for now, we don't have to worry about that, okay? But those are the three branches off of the aortic arch here. One thing I want to point out is right here. There's a structure, you can see it in the illustration, and you can see it over here too, a little bit of it in the cadaver heart. It's called the ligamentum arteriosum. And basically it's a little layer of connective tissue. And that ligamentum arteriosum is basically, it's non-functional in newborns and adults, but kind of like with the foramen ovale in a fetus, it served a function. And actually, this ligamentum arteriosum wasn't really just connective tissue in a fetus. It actually was a vessel, a little vessel called the ductus arteriosus. And you'll see that in your SPOs. So this ductus arteriosus, this little vessel in a fetal heart, connected the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. And so blood could, again, bypass the non-functional fetal lungs. Instead of going to the pulmonary arteries and to the lungs, the blood coming from the pulmonary trunk could go right into the aorta through the ductus arteriosus of that fetus and bypass the non-functional fetal lungs. Again, when we take our first breath out of the womb, that closes off and we end up with just connective tissue called the ligamentum arteriosum. And we no longer have kind of the bypass of blood when we take our first breath. Okay, so let's see. I think that's good there. Let's see, get that. All right, so let's talk about the coronary vessels that we can see here. So the coronary blood vessels, they supply and take blood to and from the actual cardiac muscle tissue, so the myocardium especially. That blood, those cells of the myocardium, they are fed by coronary blood vessels. So that's what all these kind of smaller vessels on the surface of the heart represent, the coronary arteries and the veins. And so I think there's, if I remember correctly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all together in your SPOs that you have to know, or actually 7, excuse me. And so there's a lot more than that, but just 7 in your SPOs that you need to worry about. So the left and right coronary arteries, they both branch off of the aorta. So the aorta is going to carry oxygenated blood, that's why it's red here. It's going to carry oxygenated blood from the left ventricle to all body tissues. And some of that blood gets diverted to the right coronary artery, and it's hard to see exactly where, but it's the base of the aorta that the right coronary artery branches off, and that right coronary artery kind of travels around sort of between the right atrium and right ventricle. And we have what's called a marginal branch to that coronary artery. It's actually a right and a left marginal branch. But in your SPOs, just worry about this right marginal branch here. And I think it's just marginal branch in your SPOs. But anyway, the right coronary artery has that marginal branch branching off of it. And then that right coronary artery, it continues, and you can't see it in this image right now. We'll see it in a second. But it continues, and it goes around the back of the heart, the posterior portion, and it then travels down between the right and left ventricle, and it's called the posterior interventricular artery. So I'll show you here. So this is a posterior view. Here's that right coronary artery branching around to the posterior side of the heart, and then you can see it comes down between the ventricles here. So that's called the posterior interventricular artery. So let's go back to this image. So that's the right coronary artery, and it's 2 major branches. And then we have the left coronary artery. It's hard to see where it, again, branches off of the aorta because the pulmonary trunk is anterior to it. But that left coronary artery goes and it travels from the aorta. It's, again, posterior to the pulmonary trunk. And then it comes, and it has 2 major branches. The branch that comes down on the anterior side here between the ventricles is called the anterior interventricular artery. And then the other branch that continues and goes around to kind of looks like the posterior side of the heart is called the circumflex artery. So here we have the left coronary artery, just a little bit of it, because the pulmonary trunk is covering a lot of it. The anterior interventricular artery branches off of it. And then the circumflex artery, it's not even labeling here because you can't really see a lot of it, but that's the other major branch of the left coronary artery. Okay, let's see, circumflex artery, we got that. All right. And then we have what's called the coronary sinus. And so the coronary sinus is basically the biggest coronary vein around the heart. So all the coronary veins basically end up dumping their deoxygenated blood into this coronary sinus. So it's on the posterior side of the heart, kind of inferior posterior portion, and all that blood from the coronary sinus gets dumped into the right atrium, along with all the other deoxygenated blood coming from the systemic circuit. That also gets dumped into the right atrium. So the vena cavas dump into the right atrium, and the coronary sinus, they also dump into the right atrium. Okay, now on to the valves. So actually, let me show you this real quick before we get to the valves. This is pointing to the opening of the coronary sinus. So remember that dumps into the right atrium. But in that, actually, you can also see the fossa ovalis, that indentation we mentioned in the interventricular septum. So again, just that in newborn hearts and in our hearts we have that. And then there'd be a hole there if it was the foramen ovale in a fetal heart. Anyway, on to the valves. So we mentioned there are valves, and we mentioned them earlier, but we'll mention all 4 of them now. So the valve here between the right atrium and the right ventricle is called 2 things. Either the tricuspid valve, it has 3 cusps. That's why it's tricuspid. We're not going to get into, these things called cusps, but anyway, that's where it gets its name. Or the right AV, which stands for atrioventricular. So it's the right atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve. Between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we have the bicuspid valve, also known as the left atrioventricular valve. And it has one more name, the mitral valve. And so the mitral valve comes from, I'm not sure if you can visualize the hat that the Pope is known for wearing. But anyway, that is called a mitre, and they thought it looked like that. Early anatomists did, so they gave it that mitral name. So anyway, make sure to know all 3 names for that bicuspid valve, and then the 2 names for the tricuspid valve. There's 2 more valves, and they are semilunar valves. And the first semilunar valve is between the pulmonary trunk and the right ventricle. That's called the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then the other semilunar valve is between the aorta, and again, the pulmonary trunk is kind of covering a lot of the aorta, but here's the other semilunar valve, using my laser pointer to outline. It's between the left ventricle and the aorta, or the ascending aorta, and it's called the aortic semilunar valve. So in APR and some other programs, they often don't put semilunar with these valves. They'll just call it the aortic valve, for example, or the pulmonary valve. So just keep that in mind if you're using APR, that sometimes semilunar is left off of the name of these valves here. But those are the valves. And basically what they do, in lecture you may talk more about this, is they ensure one-way flow of blood. And so, for example, the blood is going to flow through this tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And then when the right ventricle contracts, that blood shouldn't go back up into the right atrium. It should instead go through this pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. And usually that's what happens. And so this tricuspid valve is going to close as that right ventricle contracts to ensure that blood only goes in one direction. And in this case, through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. And so that's the idea for these valves, is to ensure one-way flow of blood. You might have heard of a murmur before. And a murmur is basically where you might have a leaky valve. And so if the tricuspid valve doesn't close all the way, then you could have some blood leak up through that valve as the right ventricle contracts. And you may be able to hear a noise through a stethoscope of that occurring. And so the term for that is a heart murmur. And you might have heard of that before. Okay, so I think we covered all that. A couple other terms here in your SPOs dealing with these valves. You see these tendinous cords connected to the valves and also to part of the heart here, the ventricles. These tendinous cords here of the tricuspid and bicuspid valve, these are called the tendinae cordi, or cordi tendinae, I should say. Tendinous cords is another name for them, but in your SPOs, they're called the cordi tendinae. So that's what these are, and basically they're going to help to kind of keep these valves closed as the ventricles contract. And then connecting the tendinae cordi, or the cordi tendinae, to the valve, the tendinae, the cordi tendinae attach to the valve we mentioned, these tricuspid and bicuspid, but they also attach to these nipple-like or finger-like projections of muscle tissue in the ventricles called the papillary muscles. So you can see one papillary muscle here, another one on the right side, another one, and on the left side also papillary muscle. So as these muscles contract, they kind of help to tighten the chordae tendineae and ensure that the valves don't flap up into the atria as the ventricles contract. But anyway, those are the papillary muscles we can see there. So let's take a look at some other images of cadaver hearts, and you'll see these in APR as well. Quite a few on your exam, so definitely study these cadaver hearts. And so we point out a couple things. Here's an opening into the inferior vena cava. Here's superior vena cava. Both dump into the right atrium. Blood flows down through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. You can see the chordae tendineae here. And then this is not a very deep cut of the heart, so we can see still the pulmonary pumping into the pulmonary trunk here. So this is a little portion of the pulmonary trunk. This would be the pulmonary semilunar valve, a little bit of it we can see. So from the right ventricle, when it contracts, blood goes through the pulmonary valve here into the pulmonary trunk. Over on the right side, they're cutting it a little bit deeper. You can still see a little bit of the pulmonary trunk here, but now you're starting to see more into this ascending aorta. So here's the ascending aorta on the left side of your screen, and here's the right coronary artery kind of branching off of it, just the little bit of it that they cut. But here is the aorta here too, and you can see the aortic valve, the aortic semilunar valve. So you can't really see into the left ventricle, but again, blood coming from that left ventricle goes through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta here. So you can't really see the left atrium at all here, or the left ventricle. Same thing over here. Can't really see either of those. You can see a little bit of what we call the auricle of the left atrium, and those are the ear-like flaps of the atria, these auricles. And actually, I remember now, I skipped that, didn't I? So I'm going to go back and show you another image, okay? Here, this image. So we can see here this ear-like flap of the atrium. It's kind of an expanded pouch of the atrium. This is the left side, so this is the left auricle. And on the right side, we have one too, kind of an expanded pouch of the atria on the right side. It's called the right auricle. And actually, if you touch your ears, your cartilage of your external ear, those are actually also called auricles, and that's kind of where they get their name. They have this ear-like look to them, these flaps called the auricles. Okay, so I forgot I mentioned that, so I wanted to go back to make sure I covered that. All right, so let's jump ahead. All right, let's see. We can see here on the left side a papillary muscle. Remember the chordae tendineae, this tendinous cords here, they attach to these kind of finger-like projections, the papillary muscles. All right, so not sure why I put that one in there. All right, so here I wanted to show you also the coronary arteries. So we have the right coronary artery. Here's the aorta. Branching off the aorta, we have the right coronary artery. We have the marginal branch here, and then it continues to the posterior side of the heart. You can't see it, to the posterior interventricular artery. And then the left coronary artery, this is the pulmonary trunk here, and it's behind the pulmonary trunk, but then the branch of it coming down here is the anterior interventricular artery. Can't see the circumflex artery at all here in this image. Or, as I mentioned, the posterior interventricular artery. You can't see that as well. This would be the superior vena cava. Down here, you can't really see the opening to it, but inferior vena cava. Again, pulmonary trunk, aorta, ascending aorta. These are actually pulmonary veins. and bringing blood from the lungs into the heart. And you can't see the other pulmonary veins on this view. Okay, so we saw that. Okay, so like I mentioned, I'm going to have a handout and a video to help you learn the pathway of blood flow through the heart and the body. So definitely, maybe print out that handout and try to label it on your own, and then watch the video to see how you did labeling it, okay? But you'll see that in your SPOs telling you you have to be able to do that for your exam. You'll see some questions about blood flow using the structure names on your exam. Okay, and then finally, we already talked about this. By the way, this deals with pulmonary circulation, pumping blood to the lungs and from the lungs back to the heart, and then systemic circulation, pumping oxygenated blood to all body tissues, and then carrying that deoxygenated blood back to the heart from all body tissues. So I already mentioned the systemic and pulmonary circuits. That's kind of why I was going to just go over it real quick with this image. But anyway, in your textbook, they have images that deal with those two circuits if you still have trouble understanding what they are. Okay, and then finally, on your exam, you have to be able to identify cardiac muscle tissue and a term, which is intercalated discs. So kind of like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is striated. It has these striations. And you might remember from learning about muscle tissue that these striations are all about the myofilaments, actin and myosin. And these real thick, dark lines that you see in cardiac muscle tissue, they're not striations. They're actually structures called intercalated discs. And intercalated discs, what they do is they help to bind adjacent cardiac muscle fibers together. And so you see the kind of the faint lines, those are the striations, and then these darker, thicker lines, those are the intercalated discs. So that does it for helping guide you through the heart anatomy portion of your SPOs. Hopefully this was helpful, and definitely take advantage of that handout of blood flow through the heart and the video that corresponds with it. So that's it for now, and I'll talk to you later.